The first thing anyone noticed about Sergeant Dax Brenner was the laugh. Not the kind that came in polite company, not the chuckle of a man amused by a joke, but a full-bodied, sharp-edged bark that told the universe it could go to hell, and he'd enjoy the ride down. That laugh had echoed across battlefields, reverberated through bunkers, and once made a Zelthian commander surrender before the first shot was fired. The second thing they noticed was the gun. The M134X rotary cannon, modified well beyond regulation, spun like a turbine of death at his side. No one knew exactly how he got clearance to carry it. Some said he forged the paperwork. Others swore High Command just gave up trying to stop him. Either way, when that barrel started to turn, the laughing stopped. And that was the problem. It had been 3 weeks since the warship Endeavour crash-landed on Eridani 6, a jungle moon on the outer edge of contested space. A green hellscape of dense vegetation, monolithic trees, and alien fauna that defied logic. The crew survived the impact, but their situation was dire. The ship's distress beacon was barely functional, the atmospheric interference meant no long-range communications, and worse, there were things out there. Big things. Fast things. Hungry things. "They are testing us," said Lieutenant Vasquez, watching from the edge of their makeshift encampment. She had a rifle slung across her back, her fingers tense on the grip. "Scouting patterns. They're learning our habits." Brenner snorted, spinning a cigar between his fingers. "Then they should have done more homework. I'm the one teaching today. That overgrown chainsaw of yours won't scare them forever." He grinned, that wicked stretch of teeth beneath his scarred jaw. "That's 'cause I haven't used it yet." The creatures, tentatively labeled Ravagers, had started appearing on the second day after the crash. At first, it was only shadows in the mist, glowing eyes watching from the treetops. Then came the night raids, low growls in the dark, claw marks on the hull, bodies torn apart before anyone could scream. The survivors were down to 14. It would have been 13, but Brenner didn't count himself among the ones who could die. Corporal Henson adjusted his glasses, nervously glancing at a motion tracker strapped to his wrist. "You sure they're out there?" "I mean, I know they are, but what if?" A howl, low and guttural, rolled through the jungle. Henson paled. "That." Brenner stood, stretching his shoulders. "Good. Means they're hungry." Vasquez shot him a glare. "You really wanna invite them in?" They were coming anyway. Might as well roll out the welcome mat. There was something different about tonight. The air felt heavier, thicker. The jungle, usually alive with an unholy orchestra of chirps, roars, and alien mating calls, had gone dead silent. It was never silent. Henson swallowed. "Something's wrong." The floodlights flickered, and a sound like tearing metal rang through the trees. Then the screaming started. Brenner was already moving, his cannon roaring to life as he vaulted over the barricades. The first Ravager tore through the perimeter, a nightmare of black chitin and twisted sinew, moving like liquid death. It was on Vasquez before she could fire, its claws just inches from her throat, when the first burst of 7.62 mm rounds carved a trench through its torso. The laughter began. Brenner's gun howled as he pivoted, stitching a line of devastation through the tree line. The jungle erupted into chaos, more shadows moving, more eyes glowing. The perimeter alarms failed, overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They weren't testing anymore. They were attacking. Henson fumbled with his sidearm, but another Ravager lunged, too fast. Before its fangs could close around him, a blur of motion sent it sprawling. Vasquez, blood on her face, had tackled the thing, her knife plunging into the gap between its armored plates. More were coming. A lot more. "Back to the ship!" Vasquez shouted, slamming another magazine into her rifle. "We can't hold the perimeter." Brenner just grinned, pivoting his cannon to full rotation. The weapon roared at 3,000 rounds per minute, the muzzle flash illuminating the nightmare stampede closing in. "I am the perimeter." Something hit him. Hard. The world flipped, his body crashing through twisted foliage, the rotary cannon yanked from his grip. He landed hard on his back, blinking against the stars swimming in his vision. His fingers found the ground. No, not ground. Something wet. Something warm. Blood. His own. Brenner blinked, his mind catching up to the impossible. He'd been hit. The Ravager loomed above him, larger than the rest. This one was different. More armored. More aware. A leader. The gun was too far. He reached for his sidearm. The thing moved. Too fast. Pain exploded through his ribs, claws raking across his side. Brenner coughed, spitting red. The Ravager cocked its head, studying him. For the first time in years, Brenner wasn't laughing. It lunged. A gunshot. Then another. The Ravager staggered back, a snarl ripping from its throat. Vasquez. She stood atop a pile of corpses, rifle raised, her face hard as steel. Get up, Sergeant. Brenner exhaled, his fingers wrapping around a jagged rock. The thing lunged again, but this time, he was ready. The rock met its skull with a sickening crunch. It reeled. Just enough. Vasquez fired again, the rounds ripping through its exposed joints. The creature faltered, its movements sluggish. Brenner didn't hesitate, he grabbed its mandibles, twisted, and ripped. The crack of breaking cartilage echoed through the clearing. The Ravager collapsed. Brenner stood, breathing hard. The pain was there, a dull roar in the back of his mind, but he shoved it down. Thought you were bulletproof, Vasquez said, stepping beside him. He wiped blood from his lips. Nah. Just harder to kill. Another howl echoed through the jungle. The remaining survivors had fallen back to the wreckage of the ship. But the Ravagers weren't stopping. Vasquez checked her rifle. This isn't a hunt anymore. It's a siege. Brenner picked up his cannon, slinging it over his shoulder. Then we give them a war. The Ravagers didn't wait. The jungle erupted with the sound of snapping branches and guttural snarls, the shadows shifting like a living tide. Brenner and Vasquez sprinted back toward the ship, gunfire crackling behind them as the remaining survivors laid down covering fire. Move! Move! Vasquez shouted as she vaulted over the barricade of scavenged metal and debris. Brenner was right behind her, his boots pounding against the mud. His side throbbed where the Ravager had slashed him, but he ignored it. Pain was just a suggestion he didn't feel like listening to right now. Henson pulled him up the last step. They're everywhere. They're coming from all sides. No shit, Brenner grunted, spinning his cannon up again. The ship's wreckage wasn't much of a fortress. The Endeavor had hit the jungle canopy at an angle, tearing through miles of trees before embedding itself in the soft, swampy earth. The hull had buckled, the landing gear sheared off completely. The rear engines were flooded, the fuel reserves cracked open like an overripe fruit. And worst of all, the distress beacon was barely holding on, an intermittent flicker of static that might as well have been a dying firefly in the void. Still, it was their last stand. The survivors formed a semicircle around the shattered nose of the ship, using whatever cover they could find. A few cargo crates had been reinforced with welded scrap. Some of the engineers had jerry-rigged a crude electrical fence using scavenged conduit wiring. It was laughable. It was desperate. It was all they had. The jungle moved. Vasquez was already shouting orders. Focus fire. Keep them out of melee range. Don't let them break the line. The first wave hit like a tsunami. Ravagers leapt from the darkness, eyes glowing like infernal embers. Their bodies twisted in impossible ways, their sinewy limbs contorting as they crashed against the perimeter. Brenner's cannon roared. 3,000 rounds per minute. That was what it could do. That was what it was made to do. The first Ravager's body exploded midair, shredded into a fine mist of chitin and gore. The next two didn't fare any better, their charging forms turning into red and black smears across the mud. The laughter started again. Henson was reloading frantically. I swear to God, if we get out of this, I'm getting reassigned far away from you. You love it. Brenner barked, pivoting and mowing down another Ravager before it could tear into Vasquez. The thing shrieked as it was sawed in half. Another came from the side. Brenner spun, but it was already in the air. He barely had time to react before something slammed into him, knocking him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, his vision swimming. The Ravager was on him before he could move. It snarled, its fanged more inches from his face, hot breath washing over him like a furnace. He pushed back, hands gripping its throat, but it was too strong. His gun was still strapped to his shoulder, useless at this range. Then a shotgun blast obliterated its skull. Brenner blinked through the blood splatter. Vasquez stood over him, pump action still smoking. I really hate these things. Brenner shoved the corpse off him, grabbing her outstretched hand. You ever think about a career change? Something less murdery? She smirked. You first. They didn't have time to celebrate. Henson screamed. Brenner turned just in time to see a Ravager inside the perimeter, its claws buried in Henson's side. No! Vasquez fired, but it was too late. Henson coughed, blood bubbling at his lips. The Ravager lifted him like a ragdoll, snarling. Brenner moved without thinking. The cannon was too slow, too bulky. So he grabbed a wrench from a nearby crate and swung. It cracked against the Ravager's jaw with a sickening crunch. The creature reeled, momentarily stunned, and that was all the opening Brenner needed. He swung again. And again. And again. The fourth strike shattered its skull, sending chunks of bone and pulped brain across the deck. Brenner turned to Henson. The kid's breathing was shallow. The gashes in his side were deep, too deep. No, 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 Vasquez muttered, kneeling beside him. Stay with us. Henson tried to speak. Blood spilled from his lips. His eyes flickered. Then he was gone. Silence. For a brief moment, everything else faded. Then the howling started again. Vasquez clenched her jaw. They are just going to keep coming. Brenner exhaled, gripping his cannon. Then we do something stupid. She glanced at him. Define stupid. We take the fight to them. Vasquez stared at him. That's suicide. Brenner grinned. Only if we die. The jungle loomed ahead, black and endless. Vasquez, Brenner, and the remaining survivors moved in a tight formation, weapons raised. The air was thick with the scent of blood, smoke, and jungle rot. Their goal was simple: find the Ravager's nest and make sure nothing walked out of it alive. The deeper they went, the more they saw the truth. The jungle wasn't just a jungle. It was built. Brenner ran a hand over one of the massive trees. The bark felt wrong, synthetic. Like a shell covering something else. Vasquez cursed. This isn't just a planet. Brenner's fingers traced an engraving beneath the bark, something ancient. Something alien. This is a hive. And they were walking straight into its heart. The realization came too late. The ground collapsed beneath them. They fell. Down into the dark. Darkness swallowed them whole. Brenner's stomach lurched as they plummeted, his hands clawing at the air for anything to grab onto. The tunnel they'd fallen into wasn't just a hole, it was a trap, a living structure designed to funnel prey straight down into the heart of the hive. The others fell around him, their shouts lost to the deafening roar of rushing air. Vasquez twisted midair, reaching for her belt, and a second later, her emergency grapple shot out. It caught onto a jagged outcrop of something, not quite rock, not quite metal. She yanked hard, halting her descent with a bone-rattling jerk. The others weren't as lucky. Brenner slammed into the ground, his armor taking the worst of the impact, but pain still rattled his bones. He groaned, rolling over, just in time to see the rest of the squad hitting the ground around him. Some hit wrong. Bones snapped. A scream cut short. Only 5 of them were still moving. Vasquez slid down a few seconds later, landing with a grunt beside him. You good? Brenner spat blood. Never better. The cavern around them was wrong. The walls pulsed, as if breathing. Dark, slick surfaces reflected the dim glow of their wristlights, revealing organic structures, grooved ridges that resembled both ribcages and reinforced bulkheads. It was neither rock nor metal, but something in between, something grown. They weren't in a cave. They were inside the hive. Shit, one of the surviving soldiers whispered. We're in their nest. Vasquez turned, scanning the chamber. Where the hell are the bodies? There should be remains, other victims, corpses. Brenner adjusted his grip on his rotary cannon. No bodies means they don't leave leftovers. That realization didn't sit well. Then the clicking started. It echoed through the chamber, a deep, rhythmic chittering sound. Not just one voice, but many, a chorus of things whispering just out of sight. "They know we're here," Vasquez muttered. "Good," Brenner growled, spinning up his cannon. "Saves me the trouble of knocking." A sudden screech cut through the air, and then the walls started moving. Ravagers emerged from the darkness, crawling from holes in the walls, unfolding from crevices, their black, chitinous bodies blending seamlessly into the surroundings. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Their claws scraped against the living floor, their elongated heads twisting unnaturally. And at the center of it all, something bigger. Something ancient. The hive matron. It was unlike the others. Taller, broader, covered in layered plates of biomechanical armor. It had a crown of razor-like spines running down its elongated skull, its 6 limbs ending in jagged blades instead of claws. But the worst part? It was laughing. A low, gurgling sound, a perfect mockery of human laughter, as if it had learned, stolen the sound, and was now throwing it back in their faces. Brenner's fingers tightened around his cannon. "All right," he muttered. "That pisses me off." The matron moved. Faster than anything that Big should have been able to. Brenner fired. The cannon screamed, unleashing a solid wall of high-velocity rounds. The first wave of Ravagers exploded into chunks of meat and chitin, their shrieks cut short in a burst of gunfire. But the matron didn't stop. Bullets slammed into its armored torso, sparking against its reinforced plating. It staggered slightly but kept coming, its bladed limbs whipping forward. Brenner barely had time to react before it was on him. A blur of motion, then pain. Something smashed into him, launching him backward. He hit the wall with a crunch, the wind knocked out of his lungs. His cannon flew from his grasp, skidding across the floor. The matron stood over him, its elongated head tilting mockingly. Brenner coughed, tasting blood. Then Vasquez was there. She fired a grenade round directly into the matron's face. The explosion sent the creature reeling, shrieking in pain. Brenner wasted no time. He lunged, grabbing a discarded Ravager blade from the ground and rammed it upward into the matron's side. It screeched, the sound like tearing metal. The others opened fire. The chamber exploded in gunfire and chaos. The Ravagers surged forward, but Brenner and the squad held their ground, fighting like hell. It was desperate, bloody, brutal. Claws slashed, gunfire roared, grenades detonated in fiery bursts. Then Vasquez's voice cut through the carnage. "The ceiling." Brenner looked up. The organic plating above them wasn't just a ceiling. It was a fuel line. Something alive, pulsating, filled with volatile bioorganic fluid. A weakness. Vasquez threw him a look. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Brenner grinned. "I like where this is going." She yanked the last high-yield explosive from her belt. Then threw it. The detonator clicked. The explosion ripped through the chamber. The hive screamed. Flames erupted, licking across the walls, igniting the fuel-rich organic structures. The matron reeled, its massive body silhouetted against the firestorm. Its shriek was deafening, an animal howl of rage and fear. For the first time, it was afraid. Brenner took one step forward, breathing hard, drenched in blood and ash. Then he laughed. The matron's eyes locked onto him, and it understood. He wasn't afraid of it. It was afraid of him. Brenner reached down, grabbing his fallen cannon, and as the flames consumed the hive, he pulled the trigger one last time. The laughing stopped. Fire consumed the hive. The explosion had set off a chain reaction, igniting whatever sick, organic fuel pulsed through the Ravager's nest. The walls buckled, the ground quaked, and the entire cavern was collapsing inward like a dying lung. Brenner stood in the middle of the carnage, his cannon still spinning, empty brass casings clinking against the burning ground. His breath came heavy, but his grin was feral. The matron was still alive. Barely. The once majestic horror lay in a broken heap, its towering form hunched, body riddled with bullet holes, cracks forming along its plated armor. Its limbs twitched, its shrieks garbled and wet. The fire reflected in its glowing eyes, as if it finally understood. Brenner strode forward, his boots crunching through alien bone. It flinched. "Not so funny now, is it?" he growled. The matron hissed, trying to rise. Brenner raised his cannon, but Vasquez put a hand on his shoulder. "No. Let it burn." He hesitated, then nodded. The hive collapsed behind them. They ran. The tunnels twisted and shook, splitting apart under the force of the explosions. Fire raced through the chitin-lined passages, consuming everything in its wake. Ravagers shrieked in agony as they were engulfed. Some tried to flee, clawing over each other, but there was no escape. The hive was dying, and they were about to die with it. Vasquez sprinted ahead, leading the remaining survivors, only 3 now. "Exit's got to be close," she shouted. Brenner panted, his injuries catching up with him. "If it's not," he dodged a collapsing beam of flesh metal, "we make one." Then he saw light. A hole. A breach in the hive structure, where the explosion had ripped open a path to the surface. "Go!" Vasquez roared. They dived through. Then the world went white. The final explosion erupted behind them, a violent blast of heat and alien blood. The shockwave tore through the jungle, flattening trees, sending debris flying in all directions. Brenner hit the dirt, rolling as the fireball expanded skyward. Silence. Then coughing. Groaning. They were alive. Brenner rolled onto his back, staring up at the alien sky, lungs burning from the smoke. He let out a ragged chuckle. Vasquez collapsed beside him, gasping. "I swear to God, Brenner, if you laugh right now, I'll shoot you." He snorted. "I think I used up all my bullets." She wiped blood from her face. "You love this shit, don't you?" Brenner turned his head to look at her. "What gave it away?" She let out a weak laugh, shaking her head. "You're insane." He propped himself up on his elbows, glancing at the wreckage. The hive was gone, completely obliterated. Whatever intelligence the Ravagers had, whatever horrors had bred them, it all died in that inferno. For the first time in days, the jungle was silent. Then, a beep. Vasquez's wrist console flickered. Her eyes widened. The distress beacon, it's transmitting. Brenner smirked. "About damn time." A crackle of static burst through their comms. "This is UEF command, we've received your signal." Vasquez grabbed her radio. "Command, this is Lieutenant Vasquez. We have survivors. The Endeavor crashed, but the threat has been eliminated. Request immediate extraction." A pause. Then, "Copy that, Lieutenant. We're sending a retrieval team. Hang tight." Brenner let out a low chuckle. "You hear that, Vasquez? We won." She exhaled, letting the weight of it sink in. "Yeah, we did." The last 3 survivors slumped against the jungle floor, exhausted but alive. Brenner reached into his belt, pulling out a crushed, half-burned cigar. He glanced at Vasquez. "You smoke?" She rolled her eyes. "I just survived an alien war zone, Brenner. Give me the damn cigar." He lit it, took a long drag, then passed it to her. They sat there, staring at the burning wreckage of the hive, waiting for the drop ship that would take them home. Brenner let the silence linger. Then, he started laughing.